Good morning, first of all. So today, basically, I'm going to talk about the heart rate response with respect to small-sided games. And some of the slides may have too much on it or whatnot, but let's not focus about that. Let's just keep it just a conversation. And then hopefully this will lay the groundwork for us to go downstairs. And I brought some of the units, some of the GPS heart rate units, and we'll attach them to the players we have who are so kind to volunteer. And we can actually see this theory in action. And hopefully it'll spark more questions. All right. So I don't know what to do about the format, but let's keep going. So in high performance sport, essentially what's important is for the training stimuli, whatever you're putting your players to, or your athletes through, to be similar to the competitive demand, and also to be sport specific. So those are two things that we have to always consider when we're working in high performance. So small-sided games essentially allows us and allows coaches to reproduce the physical, the technical, the tactical requirements of a real match within their training program. So it's not necessarily an isolated issue in order to get the technical and the tactical and physical developments, but it allows us to get the best out of all those three components just using simple small-sided games. And so essentially these small-sided games are function to increase the physical fitness and also the technical and tactical demands and performance of the players in a variety of different kinds of soccer codes. So the intensity is what we really care about with respect to, from a physiological perspective. We want to make sure that the games and the training sessions reach certain goals that we want with respect to intensity. And so the small-sided games, essentially, the intensity of these games, because they're done with a ball, and can be affected and manipulated in a variety of different ways in order to get that physical, that technical, and that tactical response. So we can change the pitch size, we can change the player number and the number of players we have. Coach encouragement is a huge factor. The training regiment, whether do we tell them to play 4v4 for 24 minutes straight, or do we break it up into 6-minute periods. The rules of the game, whether that's to score a certain from a certain section, to receive a pass in a zone, etc., and also the use of goalkeepers. But today I'm just going to, these factors are very complex, and it's multifactorial. So today's concentration is just going to be with respect to pitch size and player number rather than hitting each one of those points. So it's very important for coaches to understand and have an understanding of the influence of these factors in order for them to modify their training so that they can achieve the physical, technical, and tactical goals. So it's very important as a fitness coach to understand the training objectives when you're implementing the small-sided games. Being able to develop the physical profile of the soccer player within a very short time while encompassing and allowing technical and tactical components to be utilized makes small-sided games a very appealing training protocol for fitness coaches, for the players, because they're involved, they're engaged. It's football, it's not just linear or repeated sprint running. And obviously the coaches. So the basic physiological component that we're interested in with respect to small-sided games has to do with that aerobic endurance. We know from obviously experience and from the science and the research that football or soccer in essence is classified as an endurance sport. So therefore having that endurance to cover 12 to 14 kilometers in a 90-minute, arguably 90 minutes plus period is crucial, and it taxes the aerobic system. And players who are able to perform at very high intensities and able to recover, therefore having a high aerobic capacity, are usually the ones that are more successful and have a higher level of competition than the ones that don't. And so these small-sided games are therefore also, because their ability to enhance the aerobic endurance system, are comparable to high-intensity interval running or HIIT as people like to call it. And so all these things come into effect with respect to using specific markers that measure the intensity of the small-sided games, measure the effort of the players, and that includes, for example, the heart rate. And it's been shown that on average, small-sided games can elicit heart rate response in players ranging between 85 to 95% of their heart rate max, which is extremely high, and it's in a zone that essentially that you want in order to elicit those aerobic kind of adaptations in your players. So in using small-sided games, coaches also maximize their contact time with the players, so it's not like just handing them off to the fitness coach or the AT or whatever the team has to take care of their physical needs of their players. It increases the efficiency of training, so you don't have to lose time, and it essentially reduces the total training time. And most importantly, I'm sure based on everyone's experience here, increased player motivation plays a huge role in us using small-sided games rather than, for example, repeated sprints or getting them to run up a hill or stairs or whatever old school methods.
Unless it's a treadmill.
Unless it's a treadmill, a high-speed hamster run treadmill only at Soccer Fitness. And this is also particularly beneficial to use small-sided games instead of these long, extensive kinds of training methods in an environment like Canada with limited training time and an intense fixture period. For example, when we're dealing with youth sport, university-level soccer, or the college system, or even League One and semi-professional leagues where the fixtures are very compact, the season is short, you want that optimized adaptation immediately and sustained throughout the season. However, due to those factors that I mentioned to you, the number of players, the pitch size, and et cetera, it creates a lot of inconsistencies in the literature. So I cannot stand up here and tell you, you know what, this is what you need to do. 4v4 on a pitch of 30 by 25 meters for 3 times 6 minutes each, and you're good to go. There's a lot of discrepancy within the literature with respect to what works, what doesn't work, how long they've worked. Sometimes they don't report it, sometimes they report it, sometimes they're working with Real Madrid or Barcelona players, sometimes they're working with amateur, middle-aged Danish recreational soccer players. So it's very difficult to pinpoint essentially the right recipe. Unfortunately, I don't have that for you, but we do have an outline of, okay, well, how do we approach it to optimize our training? So the current research shows that various forms of small-sided games, so a reduced number of players following football-specific rules. So when we talk about small-sided games, 2v2, 4v4, 6v6, 8v8, they provide this reliable internal response. When I was telling you we need that ability to measure intensity from the players, that's what we're measuring, the internal response of the player. So heart rate, their perceived rate of exertion, and their blood lactate concentration. And these small-sided games also provide these external loads that we can measure. So for example, total distance covered, the amount of distance covered at high intensity. These become the external loads that allow us to put the training protocol in a big picture. Therefore, the small-sided games represent this alternative to traditional interval training for developing and maintaining the aerobic fitness in soccer players while simultaneously optimizing their training tactical and technical needs as well. So how can small-sided games best be used to improve the physical capacity in footballers or soccer players? Well, as a physiologist and people that work in conditioning and the physical development of athletes, it's very important for us to understand that it's the internal response to whatever you put your players through, whatever the stimulus is or stimuli is, for example, the heart rate or the rate of perceived exertion that matters, and not the external load. So it doesn't matter how much they've ran per se on a piece of paper, but the bigger picture of, well, how much was their effort? How much did they exert energy? How much energy did they utilize? Did they feel tired? Was it a walk in the park for them? And so that determines each player's adaptation to a training stimulus, and it's therefore recommended that each player's internal load be monitored to assess how these players are coping with the stress to prevent overtraining and undertraining as well. So essentially, the exercise intensity of small-sided games can then be demonstrated through a player's movements, their physiological and their perceptual responses, and many other variables that can be controlled and manipulated by the coaches to get those responses that you want.
Question.
Yes?
Talk about internal, external, right?
Yep.
So would that be why sometimes I see a player when there are futsal games who can go no problem, and then when you put him in a regular game after 10 or 15 minutes, he's a different player? Vice versa, because it's talking about how much effort.
Right. The only way you can assess that, and I will talk about it, is through asking them, well, here's a scale of 1 to 10. 0 is you're sleeping. 10 is you can't even walk.
Right.
Where are you during the futsal game? And if they're like 5. Right. And so then during the outdoor match, there are 3, then there are a lot of different factors that come into play, but essentially it's easier for them to play in that environment. It may be a tactical decision, but if you see them just exhausted after 5 minutes of futsal, whereas in a larger format they last 90 minutes, then that's a fitness flag, right? It's a very interesting question though. So to use small-sided games as this conditioning stimulus, which is why we're here, a better understanding of the associated physiological responses need to be developed. So certain base rules that we're going to highlight. Increasing the size of the pitch increases the heart rate response. Increasing the number of players on the same size pitch reduces the heart rate response, which makes sense, right? If we're sitting here comfortably, if we get 10 more people coming in here in the same space, we're congested. Our movements and our choices and our decisions and our technical abilities are going to be limited. And therefore, you're not able to move and exert yourself. But if we keep it to just us, you can do whatever you want. You can actually move around freely, and that essentially will encourage you to move more and therefore increase the intensity of the exercise. So small-sided games, exercise intensity is increased with a reduction in player number and an increase in the relative pitch area per player. And what that means is, okay, so now if we divide the area of this room per one of us, that becomes our per player pitch area, which is a very important concept. And so, small-sided games, essentially containing fewer players, can actually exceed the match intensity and elicit similar intensities to both long and short duration high intensity interval training. The average heart rate in an elite football match is anywhere between 80 to 90%, always, regardless of level. So U12 girls versus essentially Real Madrid, the average heart rate goes anywhere from 80 to 90. Of course, there are then specific thresholds when you're comparing elite and levels of competition. But if we say, okay, a football match is 80 to 90% of your heart rate max on average, and we see heart rate averages of above 95, that tells us that we're actually training at higher intensities than the match. So therefore, if we were to be put into the match, it should be nothing. That's the general logic of physiology and football training, an overload principle. So going back to your question, these exercise intensities in small-sided games have been assessed using 3 different internal load factors. So heart rate, it's the most common measure used for objectively monitoring training intensity. It's been shown to be valid and it's reliable as an indicator and a measure of exercise intensity. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. The more I work, the more oxygen I consume because my heart rate is increasing. The less I work, the slower my heart rate, lower my oxygen consumption, less intensity I have. Blood lactate. Lactate is essentially a byproduct that is found inside the muscle that results as a result from the breakdown of glucose when there's no oxygen available. We call that anaerobic glycolysis. So when you're performing repeated sprints without the opportunity to consume the oxygen to match the clearance to break down glucose using oxygen, your body needs that energy and diverts it to an anaerobic pathway to break down glucose. The byproduct of that is the lactate. It's the lactate burn that people talk about. So by measuring the amount of lactate in the blood, that gives us a measure of anaerobic capacity and therefore physiological stress. And finally, RPE, the rate of perceived exertion. That was the scale I was speaking about, the 1 to 10 that says, okay, 1 is nothing, 10 you can't walk. What was this session for you? It's a simple, non-invasive, and very inexpensive method of monitoring exercise intensity. All you need is a printer and the scale. It's a valid indicator of the overall perception of the player, but it may not be a valid substitute for heart rate monitors. So if you can afford a heart rate monitor versus a piece of paper with a scale on it, put your money into the heart rate monitor. But if you're working with 5 different teams and you just can't be bothered with the heart rate analysis or can't afford that much, then you just have that scale, and that essentially builds the base for your performance analysis, player monitoring platforms. So all the methods that I just spoke to you about are currently used and available to assess this exercise intensity during small-sided games, but each one has its own limitations. But there's no clear evidence to suggest that one is superior to the other. So therefore, the ideal situation is start with the scale, get the heart rate monitors, and if you have a lab, then get the blood lactate, right? But other than that, the heart rate monitor and the RPE are very, very powerful together. So pitch area. Both in the absolute and the relative terms, pitch area can be varied. And this influences the intensity of small-sided games. So I talked about the relative pitch area per player, and that is simply the total pitch area. So when we say 30 by 25, you multiply that together, divided by 4v4, so that's 8 players, and then you get your per player area. And so there's this increased physiological response with an increased pitch area because I can move more. So me dribbling a ball versus me sprinting with the ball or running at high intensity with the ball elicits 2 different physiological responses. Me having to dribble and deke in this little box area 1v1 is not going to tax my aerobic system because I'm just planting, changing direction. I'm functioning at a high rate, but I'm not consuming oxygen. So that's going to lead to the anaerobic pathway. But if I have enough room to run and pass and whatnot and be involved in the match, I'm going to go towards the aerobic pathway. So in some studies, these heart rate values of the maximum heart rate and the blood lactate and the RPE are higher during the small-sided games where the players are played on a larger pitch compared to medium or small pitches. And therefore, altering the pitch size, therefore alters the intensity of the small-sided game training. So as the ratio of the playing area and the number of players is therefore increased, exercise intensity increases as well. Increased player area, this increases the playing area which each player has to cover. Therefore, there's more displacement, as I just explained, and movement with higher speeds. Actually, in 1999, Balsam Group suggested that during a 4v4 small-sided game, we can achieve intensity similar to that to a 3v3 by increasing the area. Very simple now, but essentially back then, small-sided games still weren't part of the training program, and we're still trying to figure out optimization. We still are. So variability in pitch sizes and methodologies in the current literature essentially prevent us from coming up with definitive conclusions. And one of the reasons is there are no standards. So when I say a small pitch or a big pitch, well, there's a range, but my small pitch versus your small pitch could differ significantly for the players, even if we're working with the same level and same age and gender. So this is just a table that I came across in Aguiar et al. That essentially shows the small-sided games format versus what's been reported in the literature with respect to pitch size. The range you see is 400 meters here, and essentially nearly 10 times with respect to 3v3. So their 3v3 may not be the same as the area of this 3v3. So if they find a significant response in heart rate and training and their players getting better, these guys aren't. They're not using the same identical scientific approach per se. But that should give you an idea of whatever the format, there has to be an agreed upon or a scientific basis to the area that is optimized for adaptation. So the player number can therefore also be altered within this pitch area too. Most studies have shown that these small-sided games containing a smaller amount of players can elicit a bigger or greater physiological and perceptual response. So the players have to work harder versus if you put a 4v4 in the same area as you would a 3v3. So now it goes back to that threshold pitch area, that concept of is there a threshold pitch area where after a certain point I maximize my physiological response and then it stabilizes or we don't get that response that we want. So the most pronounced reductions, so the most immediate reductions in heart rate occurs when you go from a 2v2 where each player has 125 meters per square area, and that's increased to a 3v3 in the same area, which results in an 83 meters per square area for the players, and going from a 3v3 with 83 meters square to a 4v4. So you see that the pitch area is the same, 25 by 20 meters, but you're increasing the number of players and you're closing down the amount that the players are going to work. So by closing that down, you're shifting the physiological response, but also the intensity of the match. Now, a less pronounced heart rate reduction occurs when you go from a 2v2 to a 3v3 and from a 3v3 to a 4v4 in different sized pitches. So now you're essentially maintaining a relatively decent area per player for them to function. So again, different numbers elicit different physiological and perceptual responses. And we now know that small-sided game formats elicit that higher heart rate than larger formats. And that different formats, small-sided games formats, provide different heart rate values. And one of the reasons for this is that technical requirement. So as a coach, you're looking for, okay, well, how do I, yes, you're getting your physical outcome, but am I getting that technical, tactical practice that I need my players to get, essentially? And so small-sided games with a smaller amount of players also delivers a more technical kind of practice to the players since the number of technical actions are increased due to the more involvement of the players and the less hindrance that they have. So here is a a table that essentially shows the maximal heart rate values according to different small-sided game formats. So when we have a 1v1, you get a heart rate max percentage of 75 to 80. You get a 2v2, 88 to 91, 3v3, and so forth. And you get to see this plateau essentially. This hill goes up, 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 and then goes back down. So there has to be some kind of optimized pitch area and player area in that zone, but the research still has to get it down. But it gives you a good idea and a good reference to have when you're trying to periodize your training and also prescribe training for your players. So a study in 2011 essentially showed that a small-sided game of 3v3 with 2 goalies induced much higher heart rate responses than a large-sided game, which was 9v9 plus 2 goalkeepers. And what they showed was that the players during the small-sided games spent significantly longer times in high-intensity heart rates, so above 85% of their max, which is what we want to get that aerobic adaptation going. The technical analysis of the same results showed that there was a large practical difference between the two formats, between the, let's call this 4v4, let's call that 10v10, but we know that it's essentially 3v3 with goalies and 9v9 with a goalie. They showed that there was less number of blocks, headers, and interceptions and passes and receives, but more dribbles, shots, and tackles in the small-sided game. So as a performance analyst and as a coach, when you get that data, that essentially signals the player position-specific demands and technical abilities. So now the usefulness of small-sided games extends beyond just the physical capacity and for them to touch the ball to now positional effects and positional play based on what you want to work on. So the different technical requirements enables coaches to carry out their trainings that are more suitable to the playing positions of their players, such that small-sided games could be effective for midfielders because they have more dribbles, tackles, and ball contact per player, and strikers because there's more shot opportunities. But the defenders and the center backs don't essentially exert themselves but are more involved in the blocks, the headers, and the interceptions. Large-sided games would be more suited to them. So despite the advantages of producing this higher training intensity, we get that higher number of ball contact per individual as well, and essentially a greater technical load in those small-sided games. And by having the ball at your feet, it actually increases the heart rate response, which was shown to be about three times more because of that technical load due to energy expenditure when you're moving and running with the ball versus then if you're not, right? So this idea of relative pitch area per player is extremely important, and essentially, as the number of players in the small-sided games decreased, the relative pitch area per player remained the same. The overall physiological response and perceptual response increased for players. In 2v2 games, there was a greater amount of time spent at higher heart responses, so more than 90% of the heart rate max compared to 4v4 and 6v6. And what this shows is that players spent more time above that match intensity that we're asking for that competitive demand in the 4v4 versus the 6v6. So again, the intensity goes up, but as you increase the numbers, it goes back down. So the heart rate response during the 6v6 was below the average heart rate that was reported for what we would find in a match play. And this was also the same with RPE. Players engaged in 2v2 had a higher rate of exertion versus players that were playing in 6v6. So I really like this figure here. On the left-hand side, you see the percentage max, the heart rate max. And here you see the average, essentially, the spread. And you have the different 2v2, 4v4, 6v6 compared to match demands. So now this allows you to periodize your training to say, okay, well, if my match demands, if my competitive match demands is as such in this range, then I can plan my small-sided games and their intensity based on the period I am in the week. So before a match, let's say 24 hours before a match, 36 hours before a match, you wouldn't go towards the 2v2. You would get them to play more large formatted games, 6v6, even 8v8. But after the rest period, maybe right after or the day after, when it's football fitness and conditioning, you'd be more focused on the 2v2, and essentially your prescription and the intensity is much higher. So for coaches, it's very important to understand the demands in the 11v11 when you're prescribing the stimulus throughout the week and periodization. So the higher heart rate responses during training essentially is important for that aerobic fitness in soccer players, suggesting that these smaller game formats are useful to improve the aerobic fitness of your players. Therefore, increasing the amount of players with a constant pitch area reduces the player's ability to become mobilized, and therefore their exertion in small-sided games is decreased. And again, the explanation is that increased number of players is reduced, therefore reducing the interaction of with the football and or opponents. again, this is a study that shows what I've highlighted here is the percentage heart rate max. And you can see the 2v2 is higher at 89 versus the 4v4, which is 85, versus the 6v6, which is 83. And when you compare it to the exertion of your players, you see that the highest exertion rate is 2v2 versus 4v4 versus 6v6. So what that also shows us is that players performed reduced sprint durations and number of and distances in 2v2 games due to their constraint, which essentially reflects that there's less absolute pitch space available for those higher speeds compared to 6v6. So if you have a much higher area, the players are able to sprint more and more frequently, but their involvement in the game could be much less and get much less touches on the ball, right? So perhaps the physiological and the perceptual data suggest that the 2v2 format can be used when the primary focus for you is the conditioning of that anaerobic, aerobic ability of the players, while the 6v6 small-sided games could be used to train the speed and acceleration abilities in a much larger area. Good. So, nevertheless, data was also compared between 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, 4v4, which is what we're going to show you today. And the heart rate and percentage heart rate max were greater in the 3v3 and 4v4 compared to the 1v1 and 2v2, as was shown before. But nevertheless, exercising at intensities that are close to or above 90% is required for that improvement in the aerobic fitness of the players, especially trained soccer players. So it's I don't know whether it's a science or whether it's an art, but it's definitely comes with experience and understanding essentially what you can manipulate in order to achieve what you want. One interesting study that was shown using this 1v1, 2v2, 3v3, 4v4 was that you can elicit similar responses by increasing the number of bouts. So not just having a one small-sided game, but in this study they had 6 games. 6 games of 4 minutes with a minute and a half, 2 minutes of rest in between, and then back at it, and back at it. And unfortunately, due to the format of the setup is, with the 1v1, in all of them, you start with a relatively low heart rate. But all of a sudden, what happens is, when you have the 3v3 and the 4v4, the heart rate essentially spikes. So by the 6th bout, by the last bout, the 1v1 has essentially caught up to the second bout of the larger formats. So whereas the 6th bout in all of them, the 4v4 was 92% of their max, 3v3 was 95% of their max, 2v2 was 91, 1v1 was 88. So you see essentially there's different physiological effects to those formats. And so the duration of each match was there, the number of bouts was 6, the rest between the bouts were constant, and the pitch sizes essentially are noted there and varied between the games. But at the end of the day, what we care about are these figures here. Not so much the blood lactate in the environment we're working with, but what we care about is the heart rate max, when we see that the 3v3 and the 4v4 with those bouts really gets that aerobic kind of training that you really want, and actually can be used in season if very effectively. So 1v1 games elicit that greater anaerobic response due to significantly higher blood lactate response compared to the 2v2, 3v3, and 4v4, which provide that greater aerobic capacity and characteristic. That's the takeaway message from that slide. So coaches essentially should pay attention to this small-sided game type and the number of bouts to improve and obtain that physical stimulus that you want, and the conditioning of essentially elite youth soccer players in soccer training. Again, further evidence that small-sided games with increased number of bouts, so this time 2v2, 3v3, 4v4, were performed 8 times. You get very, very high heart rate max values, and therefore the aerobic zones that you really want to focus on. And it's been suggested that this protocol actually helps with the aerobic endurance capacity and training of elite youth soccer players. Here, essentially, is the similar data where you have the 2v2, 3v3, 4v4, the duration of the match, the number of bouts, the rests and the pitch size, and then their physiological measures. And then you can see the heart rate of the 2v2 average versus the 93% of the 3v3 versus the 91. So there is this optimal zone, but again, it just has to be discovered based on your players and your experience. And a heart rate monitor. So yeah, any questions so far? Right? There's not much left, but so far so good? Yeah, makes sense. So the 8 bouts of 3v3 and 4v4 of the small-sided games results in that significantly higher heart rate response as we discussed, more so than the 8 bouts of 2v2. And this is because you're involving more players, there's a longer playing time, and therefore there's less time on the ball compared to the 2v2, and you're running into space in order to become involved. And that is essentially where that physiological response is coming from. So the lactic acid is definitely more dominant in the 2v2 than the other kinds of games. And that lactic acid actually produces a lower percentage heart rate response. Yes?
So if I'm using a 3-to-1 ratio, training to games, what I should be doing is the practice after the match. You have the match, the next practice is a recovery, then you go into this one here where you want maximum heart rate.
Yeah.
And then the match before the game, you use a larger small-sided game because it's...
Exactly.
Okay.
Like a 6v6
Right.
or an 8v8.
That's
Yeah, one of the challenges that I guess we face in this environment is the absence and the availability, right? They're not held accountable or fined.
Right.
So you do have to improvise to some extent. But also just a quick note, say you have 9 players, right? Or say you have 13 players, a number that is off. There is research to show that that floater exactly performs way more total distance and activity and whatnot. So if there is a player that you want to focus on their aerobic capacity, give it to them, because in my experience, it's usually the more technical savvy player who wants to be neutral.
Right.
But you're like, wait, hold on, I'm going to take this opportunity to prescribe it. But again, just put it in your back pocket, right?
Yeah.
So we talked about this. So the small-sided games, the smaller numbers, have higher lactic anaerobic characteristics, whereas the 3v3 and 4v4 have greater aerobic characteristics. And what this means is that the 3-a-side and 4-a-side are used for high-intensity aerobic performance development, whereas the 2v2 or 1v1 is used for developing the anaerobic performance of that player. Yes?
But that's also dependent on time, work to rest ratio.
100%.
You can manipulate the 4v4
100%.
to stimulate anaerobic also.
Exactly. And sure. But also, what else am I not telling you in this? I'm just telling you 3v3, 4v4. I'm not telling you the pitch size.
Pitch size or time.
I'm not telling you the
Rest
time.
and
Rest, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's the difficulty with the science of small-sided games, is the references I've shown you is available, and you go get it, and your own experiences and what works and what doesn't. And there is a baseline to go by, But you're right. You have to think about it. You can't use my protocol because my players don't. I can't use yours.
You basically need a heart rate, and you can measure how
Exactly.
long at that rate, and are you achieving it?
Exactly. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, winding down here, just as a comparison to high intensity interval training, because that's a very effective and very alternative way of training players. I'm not a fan of small-sided games only, and I'm not a fan of high-intensity interval training only. It's just more arsenal in your toolbox. But essentially, this evidence suggests that both small-sided games and interval training are suitable for improving the fitness and performance of soccer players. In fact, with those specific manipulations, you can achieve much higher heart rate max using small-sided games while masking the effects of exercising, because again, another problem with our environment is exercise is seen as a punishment. Whereas if you get them to do a hit, for example, and you might not get the heart rate responses that you want. So the clear, careful selection of small-sided games formats and training regimens is required to optimize the fitness and performance gains. And most likely, it's this mixed method that you really want to focus on, right? If you have the numbers, if you have a plan, if it doesn't interfere with your work, do the small-sided games. If you don't, mix it up if you've just been doing one or the other. So both are very viable for those effects. So if we look at here, the high intensity, the intensity of the heart rate max versus the type of training, we can see that tactical training, not so much. That's not the focus. There's the coach's interruptions. There's the tactical focus. It's not a conditioning time, period. That's why you really don't get the heart rate responses that you want. But all of a sudden, small-sided games, you're increasing the percentage heart rate max of your players. And then you have the circuit and interval training, which veers a little bit off of the sport-specific, but again, elicits the aerobic responses that you want. So you could incorporate it, the circuit and interval training, on a day just to mix things up, or pre-season. But again, understand that small-sided games is an excellent training tool to use for those effects. So, in conclusion, small-sided game training can be used as an alternative conditioning method for football players or soccer players. It can be used to achieve the technical, tactical, and physical skills and responses by manipulating those different variables that we talked about. But small-sided games may not always provide the sufficient internal stress to provide that desired adaptation, or it may not simulate the high-intensity repeated sprint demands of high-level competition, and it is yet not known if it can be used to replicate the highest most intense period of the match. But nevertheless, careful planning and organization of your training sessions and the appropriate manipulation of the variables, of the small-sided game variables, essentially will help you achieve the training stimuli that you need. Cool. Any questions, concerns, comments? Thank you.
Any questions? Nobody? You sure?
We had some questions throughout, so yeah, they were great. But if you have any more, by all means, let me know. Or if they come into you while we're out there, also a pleasure.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Maybe can you go back to the slide comparing the responses? Yeah, that one, the heart rate responses to different types of training. Okay, so even let's say on the highest intensity small-sided game, you're still a bit lower than what you're getting with circuit and interval training, correct?
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so why?
Why are we seeing this compared to the circuit and interval
Yeah,
training?
like what do you think is the main reason?
Well, one of the reasons is the nature of circuit and interval training is concentrated, right? You're doing a given task, whereas the nature of small-sided games is more intermittent and it's more football and unpredictable.
Yeah.
So you're not able to control the movements and the capacity and the adaptations that you want in small-sided games versus, all right, lift this, then move to that, then jump this and that, and repeat. So
Yeah.
that's
It's a great answer, and I would say, coaches, if you're thinking about this, it's easy to be dogmatic and say, well, all we want to do is soccer because we play soccer, so we should only be using soccer to train. And okay, there's some arguments there for that in support of that, but when we see the research, we see sometimes when all you do is soccer, there's a chance that your intensity might be a bit lower. Why? Because soccer is a little bit unpredictable.
absolutely.
So the big advantage to adding in some of that more general, less specific type of training, like running training, or circuits or anything, the big advantage is control.
Interval training, for example. You can control the velocity, the distance of a player on a treadmill, whereas if you tell them to run, as you know, without a heart rate monitor, and you just turn around to put a cone down, you don't know what happened, right? So, absolutely. And again, these are just tools in your toolbox to use and to be as open-minded as possible and not just football, because that could fatigue the player, and also you want different kinds of movements, right? So, yeah, that's
Great.
it. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'll thank you for that.
Thank you.
Presentation.